Functions are first-class citizens or callable objects in JavaScript. You can think of these braces as containing a list of instructions. And don't forget, we define the objects via these braces, called an object literal. Well, you can think of this as defining an object, but this object is a callable object. It's invocable. Like if I called you by your name, you're invocable. I can catch your attention and I can run some instructions. And that's exactly what we're doing here. If I was to now save this and refresh the browser, I can print out this callable object by typing its symbol name, its memory pointer that I've given it here, or I could invoke it by saying name with the parentheses and end with a semicolon. This will invoke the callable object. It will tell it to run those instructions between the braces, the executable context or the callable object. Now, also, what can you do with objects? For example, you can embed objects inside of other objects. So for example, let's create a variable called obj, and we're going to make an object again with the object literal, the braces. We're literally creating an object, and it can contain embedded objects. So I'm going to create the symbol name embedded, and you can embed objects inside of objects. Well, you can actually do this with functions or subroutines or callable objects. So let's go ahead and create a function, and then let's type in concat. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to receive this particular string here. Now I don't actually have to do this, but I'm going to come back to why I'm doing it like this later on. So we have concat, and then it's going to be name. And then inside of here, we can simply return a string with, let's say, Mr. And then I'm going to concat in name. Now, at the moment, all we've done is we've defined a subroutine inside of a subroutine or callable object inside of a callable object, just like we have here. And don't forget, arrays are objects as well. So you can embed arrays inside of arrays and objects inside of arrays. Doesn't matter. You're just embedding. You have this hierarchy of effectively objects. And that's exactly what we have here. We have callable objects nested inside of one another. And if I was to save this, all it would do is it would just run the name subroutine, and it would only return Lawrence Turton. The reason being is because I just defined this callable object. I didn't actually invoke it yet. This is still just defined. I've not invoked it like concat. So I can invoke this. And what I'd like to do is invoke it with the full name, like so. And then I'd like to return the output, the overall output from this subroutine. So what exactly is going off here? Well, let's go ahead and hit refresh. And then I want to run it to make sure it works. And you can see it says Mr. Dot, which came from our concat function, Lawrence Turton. So what happened? Well, we invoked it, we called it first of all, and it wants to run this list of instructions. This callable object is now executing, and it creates a variable called full name, and it stores the value in memory Lawrence Turton, which is the string. Then we create another subroutine, an object inside of an object, and this is going to be concat. So concat is now the symbol name in which I can reference this subroutine, and it receives an argument. So an argument is a value. It's going to receive this value, Lawrence Turton, the string, and it needs a place to store it. So we create, in essence, a variable, a parameter that will store that string whilst we're executing, and then it will delete that out of memory. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, right, that name parameter contains that string. And then we return from this subroutine when it's invoked, the string Mr. And then we say plus, well, we've got name right here, which we know that name contains the string, and then I concatenate it together. And then, of course, when we invoke it, that will return the string Mr. Lawrence Turton, and that's exactly what's happening. So when you've invoked it, it just returns that string back out again. And so there it is. That's the entire process that occurs, and you can have objects inside of objects. Arrays are objects, so arrays inside of arrays, and you can mix and match. And you can also have callable objects inside of callable objects. And you know that as well. Speaking of objects inside of objects, that you can have a standard object literal right here. And methods are in fact subroutines or callable objects nested inside of an object. And you have the same thing for arrays as well. It's just the arrays don't have a method name. They're just an element inside of the array. Now let's do something a little bit more tricky. Let's pull this back to its original state like so. And let's say that full name here, I actually want to turn it into a parameter. And this parameter will receive an object like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke name, and then I'm going to pass it an object, and it's going to have the first name, and then we're going to have last name. So there is our object that will then be passed to this parameter, this argument, and then we can start to use it within our subroutine. So now I can say return full name dot first name, and then concatenate onto that full name dot last name. So there we have it. But if I was to refresh the browser, it looks like nothing's happened, and that's because even though we've invoked it, we've not logged out the output to the console. So you need to say console.log, and then you would need to run and execute this callable object. And then after it's run, it will return the string Lawrence Turton because it concatenates those properties together, and then it will log it out to the console. So now if I hit refresh, there it is. The output's logged to the console. And so what happened? Well, this object that was invoked, and let's just simplify the syntax right here, was invoked by the parentheses. So we're targeting this callable object via its symbol name, and then the argument was passed to the parameter and assigned. And then what we're doing here is we're saying, right, return, we're accessing that object and we're pulling out the first name property, which produces the string Lawrence. So that produces the string Lawrence. We access the same object again, and the last name property contains the string Turton, and then we're concatenating that together, and then we're returning that to the console. And so that's exactly what has happened here. But now, let's now pass in a callable object to a parameter. Just like you could create a variable that can contain an object, a standard object, you can also create a variable or constant that contains a callable object like so. So you don't need to define the symbol name right there because this callable object is defined already by this symbol name. So we can call it up via obj. So you can actually put functions inside of constants and variables. So let's take a look at now passing in a callable object. Now this callable object, again, doesn't need the name placing in here because it's going to be given a symbol name when it is assigned to the parameter. So a function, a callable object that is an argument, does not need a name. It will be given a name when it's passed in to my function up here. And so there we go. We now have name function, and there is my callable object. And let's say it returns the string embed. Wonderful. So this callable object just returns the string embed. And now let's go ahead and return whatever is inside of the full name. And what we need to do again is say console.log, and we need to log the output from this callable object to the console. So save it, hit refresh, and you'll notice what it did was it printed out the function, the callable object that we defined here as an argument. So what happened was we invoke this callable object. This callable object received the argument, this callable object, and assigned it to full name. And then what it did is we took full name and we returned it like so. So we're literally returning a callable object here, this function. And so now when this function is finished executing, this callable object, it just returns this function here. That is what's returned. And that's what we have here. Now that's quite interesting. It poses a new problem. How do we actually execute this? Well, you know that potentially what you could have done is executed it by putting in the parentheses. So now we're not just returning the callable object and printing it out here. We want to say, right, execute the execution context. We want to run these instructions because we know that this callable object is in this parameter, and this parameter can then be used to invoke that particular callable object by the parentheses. So let's go ahead and save this now and hit refresh. And you'll notice it says embed. And that's exactly what it did. So to recap, functions are callable objects. They are objects that contain a list of instructions that are to be executed when they are invoked. They're invocable objects, callable. Objects can be contained inside of objects, so callable objects can be contained inside of callable objects, and you can keep nesting your callable objects inside of one another. And wherever you can pass in, let's say, an object, so you can assign an object to a variable or a constant, or you could assign a object to a parameter, you could, in fact, change that object for, in fact, a function. So now you can understand the architecture of objects. You can also understand the architecture of callable objects.